The Silent Watcher. It started with a faint tapping sound, one that Emily thought was her imagination. Living alone in a secluded cabin deep in the woods of Oregon, she was accustomed to the symphony of nature, the rustling leaves, the howls of distant coyotes, and the occasional snap of a twig under unseen paws. But this tapping was different. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as though someone or something was testing her. The first night she heard it, she was curled up on her couch, engrossed in a true crime podcast. The tapping came from the window behind her. She paused the audio and listened. Silence. She dismissed it as a tree branch brushing against the glass and went back to her podcast. The second night, it happened again. This time she was in her bedroom, reading a book under the dim glow of her bedside lamp. Tap, tap, tap. She froze, her eyes darting to the window. The curtains were drawn, and she hesitated to pull them back. Her mind conjured images of a pale face pressed against the glass, empty eyes staring back at her. She shook her head and laughed nervously. "Get a grip, Emily," she muttered. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. Summoning her courage, she yanked the curtains open. Nothing. Just the dense darkness of the forest and the faint reflection of her terrified face. By the third night, Emily couldn't ignore it anymore. She'd even begun to dread the fall of night, counting the hours until she'd hear that maddening sound. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, she armed herself with a flashlight and a kitchen knife. "If someone's messing with me, they're about to regret it," she whispered. The tapping started at exactly 11:13 p.m. She checked her watch. It had become so regular that she'd begun to anticipate it. Clutching her knife, she crept to the window, flashlight in hand. The sound was sharper now, as if nails were being dragged across the glass. With a deep breath, she flung the door open and shone the beam of light outside. The forest was silent, the only movement the swaying of branches in the cold night breeze. Then she saw them, footprints in the snow, bare footprints leading from the edge of the forest to her cabin. Her blood turned to ice. She followed the tracks with her light, but they ended abruptly a few feet from her window, as if the intruder had vanished into thin air. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her heart pounding like a drum. The fourth night was worse. Emily didn't sleep. She sat in the living room with all the lights on, the knife on the table in front of her. The tapping began as usual, but this time it wasn't just at the window. It came from multiple directions: the back door, the bedroom window, even the roof. She called the police, her voice trembling as she described the situation. "We'll send a patrol car," they assured her. The tapping stopped as soon as she hung up. When the officers arrived, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. They suggested it might be animals or even her imagination. But Emily knew better. Something was out there, watching her, toying with her. On the fifth night, she decided to set up a camera. She positioned it to face the living room window, the one where the tapping had first started. At 11:13 p.m., it began again. Tap, tap. She ignored it, her eyes fixed on the camera feed. At first, there was nothing. Then, a shadow moved across the screen. It was quick, almost imperceptible. She rewound the footage and paused it. There, in the corner of the frame, was a figure, tall, gaunt, and unnervingly still. Its face was obscured, but its presence was undeniable. Emily's breath hitched. She felt the weight of eyes on her, like a predator sizing up its prey. She didn't dare move. The tapping grew louder, more aggressive. It wasn't testing her anymore, it was demanding her attention. And then it stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. Emily glanced at the screen. The figure was gone. She exhaled shakily, thinking it was over. But then her phone buzzed. A notification from the camera app, motion detected in the living room. Her blood ran cold. She looked up and there it was. Standing in the doorway, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. The flashlight flickered, and for the first time, Emily saw its face. Hollow eyes, a mouth stretched into an impossible grin, and skin that looked like it had been stretched over a skull too large for it. Emily screamed and bolted for the back door. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, fumbling with the keys. As she sped down the dirt road, she dared a glance in the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, its grin widening as it raised a skeletal hand to wave goodbye. Emily never returned to the cabin. She moved to the city, surrounded by noise and people. But every so often, in the dead of night, she hears it tap, tap, tap. The last train to Ashmore. Rachel loved trains. There was something soothing about the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks, the soft hum of the engine, and the blur of the world outside the window. When she saw an advertisement for the Ashmore Midnight Express, a historic steam train known for its eerie tales and scenic route, she couldn't resist. The train departed only once a month, traveling through dense forests, over rickety bridges and past forgotten towns. It was a photographer's dream, and Rachel's camera was her constant companion. She booked a ticket for the next departure without hesitation. The night of the journey was chilly, the kind that seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Rachel arrived at the small, dimly lit station and joined a handful of other passengers. Most were older couples or train enthusiasts, their excitement palpable. She noticed an older man sitting alone on a bench, his coat patched and his face shadowed by the brim of a hat. He seemed to be staring at her, but when she looked again, his gaze was fixed on the ground. The whistle blew and the train emerged from the darkness like a ghost. Its black steel gleamed under the flickering station lights, and steam hissed around its wheels like restless spirits. Rachel boarded quickly, finding her seat in a nearly empty carriage. She chose a spot by the window, her camera ready for the nocturnal landscapes. As the train pulled away from the station, Rachel felt a thrill of anticipation. The conductor passed by, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too bright for his face. "Ticket, miss," he rasped. Rachel handed it over, and he stamped it with an old-fashioned punch. "Enjoy the ride. Stay seated." His words lingered longer than they should have, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. The first hour passed uneventfully. The forest outside was a dark mass, broken only by the occasional glimmer of moonlight on the river. Rachel snapped photos, trying to capture the surreal beauty of the journey. She noticed that the older man from the station was now sitting 2 rows behind her. She hadn't heard him enter. Her unease grew as the night deepened. The other passengers, once lively, now seemed oddly subdued. One by one, they began to drift into a sleep that looked unnaturally heavy, their heads lolling at strange angles. Rachel felt the hairs on her neck rise when she realized the man behind her wasn't asleep. He was staring directly at her reflection in the window. She turned sharply, but he didn't move. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he raised a trembling hand and pointed at something outside. Rachel followed his gaze, but the darkness revealed nothing. When she looked back, the man was gone. His seat was empty, though she hadn't heard him leave. The train plunged into a tunnel, and the lights flickered, casting the carriage in brief bursts of shadow. Rachel gripped her camera tightly, her heart racing. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the tunnel were swallowing the train whole. When the light steadied, she noticed something etched into the window beside her. "Don't get off." Rachel's breath hitched. She looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. The train emerged from the tunnel into a clearing where the moon illuminated an abandoned station. The platform was overgrown with weeds, and the station sign, barely legible, read "Ashmore Halt." The train screeched to a halt, and the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. "All passengers for Ashmore, please disembark." No one moved. Rachel felt a strange compulsion to stand, her legs betraying her as she stepped into the aisle. She fought it, gripping the seat back. The older man reappeared, standing at the door. "You mustn't," he said, his voice urgent. "They're waiting." "Who?" Rachel managed to whisper. But he didn't answer. Instead, he pushed past her and stepped off the train. The doors closed behind him with a metallic snap. Rachel pressed her face to the window, watching as the man stood on the platform, surrounded by shadows that weren't cast by the moon. They moved toward him, wrapping around him like smoke. His mouth opened in a silent scream before he vanished entirely. The train lurched forward, and Rachel collapsed into her seat, trembling. The other passengers began to stir, their expressions blank as though nothing had happened. The conductor passed through again, his gaze lingering on her. "Not your stop, miss," he said, almost kindly. Rachel didn't respond. She clutched her camera, now too afraid to look at the photos she'd taken. When the train finally returned to its starting point, she stumbled off, her legs weak and her mind racing. She never saw the other passengers leave. In fact, she never saw them again. When she developed her film a week later, Rachel's hands shook as she flipped through the prints. The landscapes were as she remembered, hauntingly beautiful. But in every photo, there was a shadow. Sometimes it was at the edge of the frame, other times closer. And in the last photo, taken just before the tunnel, the shadow was inside the train, seated 2 rows behind her. Rachel never took another train, but sometimes, late at night, she hears it, the mournful whistle of the Ashmore Midnight Express, calling her back for one final ride. Whispers in the pines. The pines that surrounded the little town of Briar Hollow were ancient, their towering forms casting long shadows even in the brightest sunlight. Locals spoke of strange occurrences in those woods, hunters who never returned, children who wandered too far and were found days later, silent and wide-eyed, unable to speak of what they'd seen. To outsiders, these were just stories, the kind used to scare children into staying close to home. But to the residents of Briar Hollow, the tales were warnings. Grace didn't believe in warnings. She'd moved to the town a few months earlier, a freelance writer seeking solitude and inspiration. The stories of the woods fascinated her, and she saw them as an opportunity. Urban legends always make for good material, she told a skeptical bartender one night. It's just folklore. It's not folklore, the bartender had replied, his voice low. People who go too deep into those woods don't come back the same, if they come back at all. Grace smiled politely and changed the subject. She wasn't one to be scared off by campfire tales. The next morning, she packed a bag with a notebook, a flashlight, and a bottle of water. The plan was simple: spend the day exploring the woods, take notes, and perhaps find inspiration for her next piece. The forest was beautiful, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden streams, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Grace felt a surge of confidence. How could a place so peaceful inspire such fear? She walked for hours, snapping photos and jotting down observations. The deeper she ventured, the quieter it became. The birdsong faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Grace's footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once. "It's just your imagination," she muttered, her voice oddly muffled. Around midday, she came across a clearing. In the center stood a strange structure, a circle of stones, each taller than her, arranged in a perfect ring. The stones were ancient, their surfaces etched with strange, spiraling patterns. Grace felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. She approached cautiously, her notebook in hand. The moment she stepped into the circle, the air changed. It grew colder, and a faint whispering began, so soft she thought it might be the wind. She turned, scanning the trees, but saw no one. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, as though dozens of voices were speaking at once. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. Grace backed out of the circle, her heart pounding. The whispers stopped. She told herself it was just the wind, maybe a trick of the acoustics around the stones. Still, she decided it was time to head back. Retracing her steps proved more difficult than she'd anticipated. The forest seemed unfamiliar, the path she'd taken earlier now twisting in ways she didn't recognize. The shadows grew longer, the sunlight dimmer. Grace checked her watch. It was only 4:30 p.m., but the woods felt as though night were already falling. Then she heard it, the snapping of a twig close behind her. She froze, straining to listen. Another snap, then the rustle of leaves. Someone was following her. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. There was no reply, but the sound stopped. She quickened her pace, her eyes darting between the trees. The whispers returned, louder now. They seemed to come from all around her, circling like a predator. Grace broke into a run, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in on her. Her flashlight flickered as she fumbled to turn it on, casting erratic beams of light into the encroaching darkness. She tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping her palms. As she scrambled to her feet, she saw them, figures in the shadows, just out of reach of her flashlight. They didn't move, but she could feel their eyes on her, unblinking. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to seep into her mind. Grace ran until her legs burned, until the air felt like ice in her lungs. She burst into another clearing and collapsed to her knees. The circle of stones loomed before her, impossibly back in her path. The whispers ceased, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. She felt it before she saw it, a presence ancient and malevolent, watching her from within the circle. A shadow darker than the night itself began to form, rising like smoke from the ground. 2 pinpricks of light appeared where eyes should have been, and the whispers returned, now a single, unified voice that spoke directly to her. "You should not have come." Grace couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow extended a tendril toward her, and as it touched her skin, a searing pain shot through her body. Memories flooded her mind, but they weren't hers. They were scenes of the forest, of others who had stood where she now knelt, their fates sealed by the same mistake. When she woke, it was morning. She was lying at the edge of the woods, her notebook and camera beside her. She stumbled back to town, her body aching and her mind foggy. The locals watched her with a mix of pity and fear, but no one approached her. Grace never spoke of what happened in the woods. She moved away a week later, leaving behind her belongings and her ambition. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she would wake to the sound of whispers, soft and insistent, as though calling her back to the pines.